In this land, people don't believe in ghosts. The phantoms here are far more real. They are memories of failed harvests, abandoned homes, and names no longer spoken. Jedediah Stone carries more of these phantoms than anyone. Every mile to town is a confrontation with them, with the specter of a deceased wife and the laughter of a distant daughter. He came here for purely mundane reasons, but fate, like a dust storm, had other plans. He didn't know that, in just a moment, he would face a flesh and blood ghost, a child cast out by the world, and in its eyes, he would see a curse more terrifying than death: hope. The high plains sun had long since bleached the sky to a flat, unforgiving white. It baked the ground into a pale, cracked shell, where every hoofbeat stirred up ghosts of chalky dust. Jedediah Stone pulled the brim of his felt hat, worn thin, as a memory, lower. He'd come for salt and wire, not for another mouth to feed. It wasn't a formal auction block, just a gathering of desperate men around the steps of the general store, where a crier with a raspy voice was peddling damaged goods, not human souls. Sound of limb, not prone to fever, the crier rasped. We'll work from sunup to sundown. Then they pushed the girl forward, a slip of a thing, her bare feet caked in a dust so thick she looked to have grown from the earth itself. Her hair, the shade of dried mud, was woven into a lopsided braid that looked to have been tied and retied 100 times by her own hand. She did not weep. Her gaze was flat and gray as a winter sky. Eyes that had seen too many seasons. Jedediah felt something tighten inside him, a feeling he thought he'd buried with Martha. $5. A man in a stained waistcoat shouted. The crier scanned the silent, heat-dazed crowd. $5 for a strong pair of hands? Do I hear more? The silence stretched, heavy with heat. Jedediah didn't know why he spoke. A number tumbled from his own lips, a stranger's voice in his throat. 7. All eyes turned to him. Jedediah Stone hadn't bought a thing in this town beyond necessities, since his homestead had become more a skeleton than a home. 10. The man in the waistcoat snapped. 11, Jedediah said, his voice firmer now, more deliberate. The other man hesitated, then spat on the ground. Keep her then. The girls cursed. The miles back were traveled in a heavy silence. The girl sat behind him, her small hands not touching him, but gripping the edge of the saddle leather. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the tired plod of the horse. The homestead came into view not as a destination, but as a finality. The fences listed like drunken soldiers. The barn sagged, surrendering to gravity and time. This was a place where memories came to die. He helped her down, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. This is home, he said, the word foreign. You'll sleep in the loft. There's an old cot. She said nothing, just stared at the listing house, as if measuring its strength against her own. I'll call you Sarah, he heard himself say, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. It hung between them in the hot air, a summoned ghost. The girl finally looked at him, her eyes no longer vacant but holding a cold, hard glint like flint. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than a whisper, but it was as sharp as a shard of broken steel. My work is my own, she said. I answer to God for it, not to any man. The days fell into a rhythm defined by silence and sweat. Dawn arrived not with a gentle light, but with a declaration of heat. The well had run dry years ago, its iron pump handled a stubborn, silent tongue. Water was now a thing to be fought. For from the creek, a thin, muddy artery more than a mile to the east, each morning, they made the pilgrimage. Jedediah walked with the long, purposeful stride of a man accustomed to walking over disappointments. Sarah followed, 2 wooden buckets swinging at her sides, her pace even and unfaltering. They did not speak. The land didn't ask for words, only for labor. And they paid it in full. It was the wind that announced it. It shifted mid-afternoon, carrying not a coolness from the mountains, but a dry, suffocating breath. The sky to the west began to bleed a sick orange color. Jedediah stopped, his hoe falling still. He took a deep breath. The air tasted of ash and burnt pine. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent. She was already there, her eyes on the ridge. She gave a single sharp nod. The fire appeared as a tear on the horizon, a low growl that was not of thunder, but of the world being consumed. It licked up dry trees, turning them to black torches in an instant. "Buckets," he barked, the single word shattering weeks of silence. They moved without another word, a grim choreography of survival. He drew water from the barrel, passing it to her. She, impossibly strong, scrambled up the ladder and doused the old wooden shingles of the roof. Steam hissed, joining the distant roar. When the barrel was empty, he threw her a shovel. They dug at the earth, creating a thin, desperate line between the farm and the annihilation. He worked with the fury of a man fighting his own ghosts. She worked with the quiet focus of a stone about to be overtaken by the tide. As the heat grew intense, Jedediah ran for the horse corral. The horses, eyes wide with primal terror, refused to break from their enclosure. They screamed, crowding. Into the far corner, the smell of smoke driving them mad, Jedediah swore, about to charge in and drag them out by force. But Sarah slipped past him. She walked into the corral alone. She did not shout or wave her arms. She went to the trembling lead mare. She laid a steady hand on its sweating neck and spoke, her voice a low hum, not words but a sound, a sound. Older than fear, the horse snorted, but it stilled. She let it out into the ashen clearing and slapped its flank. It bolted into the smoke-filled twilight. She did the same with the rest. When dawn broke on a blackened world, the fire had stopped. At the creek, it had not crossed. The farm stood, a gray island in an ocean of ash. They sat on the porch steps, two figures carved from soot and exhaustion. The air was cold and thick with the smell of loss. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with the shared weight of what they had endured. Jedediah cleared his throat, which was raw. "You have a spine of steel, girl." Sarah didn't answer right away. She stared at the charred ridge, where thin wisps of smoke still rose like tired spirits. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice small but clear in the still air. "For a moment, I thought the world was ending." Jedediah looked at his own calloused, ash-covered hands. "That feeling," he said softly, "it's just a reminder that it didn't." The world was black and silver in the morning light. The air smelled of rain and cold ash. In the ruin of the chicken coop, amongst the charred timbers, Sarah found it, a single survivor. A trembling chick, one wing singed and matted. It let out a weak, thin peep, a sound impossibly fragile in the vast devastation. She cupped it in her hands, shielding it from the cool wind. Jedediah watched from the porch, saying nothing. He had forgotten what it looked like to try and mend something so small. He then turned, went inside, and came back with an old cigar box, which he set on the steps. He had lined it with a scrap of cloth from one of Martha's old shirts. Sarah looked at him, then carefully placed the chick inside. That night, they sat by the hearth. The fire, now contained and comforting, danced behind the iron grate. It was no longer a monster. It was just warmth. After a long while, Sarah left and returned from the loft. She carried something wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. She carefully unwrapped it on the rough-hewn table between them. It was a small, cloth-bound book, its cover faded to the color of a dull sky. The corners were frayed. "My mother's," she said. Jedediah did not reach for it. He just looked. Sarah opened it with a quiet reverence. The pages were yellowed, filled with a neat, steady script. She read, her voice even and clear, without a tremor. "October 3rd. The late frost took the beans. We will plant again. There's always time to plant again. She looked up. She wrote about everything she planted. The words settled in the quiet room, simple and heavy as a stone. They spoke of persistence, of a quiet faith that the ground would give, if one was willing to give of oneself. Jedediah rose without a word. He went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't opened in years. The hinges groaned in protest. He rummaged beneath faded quilts and pulled out a bundle tied with butcher's twine. He came back to the table and sat the bundle down next to her mother's book. The lamplight fell on them both. A history that was read, and a history that had been refused. His bundle of letters, a dozen or so, were still sealed. The paper had yellowed. His daughter's ink had faded beneath its unopened sheath. He looked at the two stacks of paper, one open, one sealed tight. 2 lifetimes resting on a rough-hewn table. Perhaps, he thought, looking at the faded ink of his daughter's hand, it was time to break the seal. The dawn found him at the table, the unsealed bundle of letters before him. He had read them by the flickering lamplight, one by one. Each letter was a small death, a window into a life he had bricked over. His daughter Rose's words, at first pleading, then hopeful, and finally, a sad acceptance. They told of seasons, of a husband he'd never met, of a life that went on without him. He sat until the first sunbeam entered the house, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Then, with a heavy formality, he took a sheet of paper and dipped the pen in the nearly dry inkwell. His hand, more accustomed to an axe handle than a pen, struggled to form the letters. The letter was not long. It held no apology. The word was too large, too distant. It simply said that he was still here, that the snows had come early last year, and that he was sending it from a town called Redemption. He did not sign his name. He just folded it and put it in a clean envelope. Ride to town felt different this time. The silence was not an absence of words, but a shared, quiet resolve. The letter was a physical weight in Jedediah's coat pocket. He mailed it at the post office, handing the clerk the coin without a word. As they turned to leave, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Well, Stone, thought that girl would have run off on you by now." It was the man in the waistcoat. He was leaning against a post, an ugly smirk on his face. Still earning her keep? Jedediah took a step forward, a protective instinct rising in him. But Sarah put out a hand, not to hold on to him, but to stop him. She stepped forward. She looked directly at the man. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the street noise like a shard of glass. "A debt can be paid, mister," she said. "A soul cannot be owned." The murmuring on the street fell silent. A few people stopped to look. The man blinked, his smirk vanishing. He muttered something incoherent and turned, hurrying into the saloon. On the way back, Jedediah did not speak of it. He had no words for it. Instead, when they were halfway home, he held out the worn leather reins to her. She took them. For the next mile, she led the way. That evening, Sarah did not sit idly by the fire. She went to the dead fire pit outside and picked up a piece of charcoal. In the barn, she found a smooth piece of pine board, the remnant of a broken shelf by. The light of the lamp, she began to draw. Jedediah watched. She was not drawing what was pretty. She was drawing what was true, the line of this scorched ridge, black and jagged. The shape of a lone horse against a dark sky. The lines were strong, without hesitation. She was making something from there. Destruction, turning ash into image. He realized then that the girl had never been silent at all. She had just been waiting for a language the world couldn't take away. Spring arrived not as a season, but as a promise kept. The rain softened the charred crust of the earth, and against all odds, the ground began to offer up thin green shoots. Life, stubborn and tenacious, was returning. In the small garden they had tilled from the ash, the rows of onions and carrots asserted themselves, lines of vibrant green against the black soil, One afternoon in May, the mail rider left a single letter in the rusty tin box at the end of the road. Jedediah's hands trembled slightly as he recognized the script. He sat on the porch steps, reading the short lines over and over. Rose was coming. She wanted her young son to see the place where she had grown up. They arrived a week later in a hired wagon. The woman who stepped down had his eyes, but set in. A softer face, a face that had known laughter as well as tears. Behind her, a boy of about 6 held tightly to her skirt, his eyes wide at the vastness of the space. "Pa," Rose said, her voice breaking on the word. Jedediah walked down from the porch. He did not run. He walked, each step a decade of waiting. They embraced, not with a passionate hug, but with a holding on, the closing of a wound that had been open for too long. Then Rose turned to Sarah, who stood quietly to one side. The two women's eyes met. They were two women who understood what it meant to survive a long winter. Rose looked at the charcoal drawings propped against the barn wall, at the greening garden. "You kept him here," she said softly. Sarah shook her head. "We kept each other." Their new peace was interrupted the next day by another rider. This one was not the mailman. A woman with a no-nonsense set to her jaw and a silver star pinned to her vest reined her horse in the yard. "I'm Sheriff Tate," she said. "I'm looking for a girl." She unrolled a yellowed piece of paper. It was a wanted poster with a crude drawing of a younger, more frightened face. "Sarah, last seen in this territory." "I'm Sarah," Sarah answered, her voice calm. The sheriff nodded, a professional sympathy in her eyes. "We have a safe place in the next county. A home for girls who need a new start." Sarah looked not at the sheriff, but at the garden, where green shoots were pushing toward the sun. She looked up at the porch, where Jedediah sat, silent but solid as a rock. "Ma'am," she said, her voice quiet and sure, "I'm already in one." A week later, Jedediah and Sarah made the trip to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a small man with thick glasses, looked up in confusion as Jedediah explained what he wanted. To add a name to the deed? Jedediah said nothing, just signed his name on the indicated line. His script, Jedediah Stone, was firm and unwavering. Then he slid the pen across the counter to her. Sarah took the pen. She signed her name beneath his, Sarah Stone. Clear, legible, a fact now recorded in ink. On that piece of paper, in the eyes of the law and of God, they were family. The years passed like water carving the canyon, slow and unstoppable. The seasons came and went. Sarah's garden flourished, a patch of vibrant life against the brown earth. The years began to settle in Jedediah's bones like fine dust. He moved slower, and his silences grew longer. He spent more time in his chair on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for a visitor he knew was coming. One afternoon, watching a hawk ride a thermal current, he spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. "I wonder," he said, "what the sea sounds like. They say it breathes like a great beast sleeping." Sarah, who had been sketching the hawk in a notebook, looked up. She looked at his face, its lines carved by sun and sorrow. She nodded. "Then I will pack the wagon." They left the farm in the fall, leaving it in the care of a neighboring family whose children had learned to draw from Sarah. The wagon was loaded with the essentials: wool blankets, jars of jam, Sarah's carefully rolled drawings, and a letter from Rose wishing them safe travels. They traveled east. The plains gave way to rolling hills, then to dense forests of red and gold. This was not a silent journey. Jedediah told stories. Not stories of grief, but small fragments of memory. The feel of his first saddle, the taste of wild plums, a night he was lost in the woods and survived on dandelion roots. Sarah listened, and she drew their journey, the faces of strangers, crooked towns, rivers that looked like liquid glass. It was a sound first, a low, constant roar that grew until it filled the world. Then they saw it a slash of gray and blue that met the sky in a line that never ended. The air tasted of salt and distance. Jedediah stood on the sand, his boots sinking. The wind snatched his hat and threw it into the surf, but he didn't chase it. He just smiled. Martha would have liked the noise, he said. It was all that needed to be said. They rented a small cabin overlooking the shore. Sarah painted every morning, trying to capture the ceaseless motion of the ocean. Jedediah sat by the window, rereading Rose's letters, watching the gulls circle. He seemed to be listening to a conversation only he could hear. One morning, Sarah woke to a profound silence, different from the usual crash of the waves. Jedediah was still in his chair by the window, a blanket over his knees, his head tilted as if listening. His eyes were closed. The cup of coffee on the small table beside him was cold. The funeral was simple. Sarah found a local carpenter for a plain pine box. Before they closed the lid, she took a piece of charcoal and drew a single, soaring hawk on the wood. She buried him on a dune overlooking the endless water, with only a single stone for a marker. No name, no dates. Just the stone and the eternal song of the ocean. The wagon's return journey was a solitary one. The plains greeted Sarah not with the empty silence of before, but with the profound silence of absence. The house stood, resilient against the wind. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon. Light, the only inhabitants now. She did not clear out Jedediah's things. She left his chair by the window. She took his heavy wool coat from the peg where he'd last hung it, the scent of wood smoke and time still clinging to it. She hung it on the hook next to her own shawl, a silent sentinel. The earth did not ask questions. It simply accepted her grief, her sweat, her silence, and in return, it grew. She worked from dawn to dusk, her hands deep in the soil they had saved together. The garden expanded. Wildflowers, which Jedediah had once called weeds, were now allowed to flourish along the fence line. Word spread, not by advertisement, but by quiet talk in town. People started coming. A widow who came to sit on the porch and share an hour of silence with her. Children who came to see the charcoal drawings and soon were given charcoals of their own. Sarah did not teach. She simply made the space for them to find their own lines. The farm was no longer a place of ghosts, but a place of stillness. Then, one day in late summer, a figure appeared at the end of the road. A thin girl, 15 or 16, with haunted eyes and hands that clutched her own arms, as if to hold herself together. She stood there for hours, just watching the house. Finally, Sarah walked down from the porch. She said nothing, just what about her work, weeding her patch of tomatoes. After a long while, the girl spoke, her voice barely audible, carried away by the wind. Is it true what they say about this place being a second chance? Sarah looked at the girl, and in those eyes, she saw the familiar shadow of a storm that had passed. She did not answer with words. Instead, she pulled up a young tomato plant, its roots clotted with damp earth. She held it out to the girl. A second chance has to be planted, Sarah said, her voice as calm as the ground beneath her feet. Here, start with this. The girl's trembling hands took the plant. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Sarah sat in the familiar chair on the porch. Below, in the fading light, another figure was kneeling, small hands gently packing the earth around a new bit of life. The wind swept by, carrying the scent of the soil and a quiet promise. The land, once defined by what it had lost, was now known for what it grew.